Good morning. I am Kadeen Smith, Project Coordinator for the Caribbean Future Forum. Welcome to the second episode of our new CaribWebDialogue series, the SDGs and You. This is the second episode in a new series of Caribbean Future Forum webinars, which aims at raising awareness of the Sustainable Development Goals, their relevance to the Caribbean, and how we as a region can achieve these goals. In today's webinar, we will focus on gender and sexual orientation and the challenge to social sustainability. Today we have with us Mr. Colin Robinson, a leading Caribbean LGBTI advocate who will speak on and answer your questions about sex and gender diversity, clarify concepts and language, help us to understand ways in which sexuality and gender impact daily lives and are linked to development, policy making, and migration. He will differentiate regional movement priorities from global discourse and identify openings and priorities for change and action through leadership, domestic law and policy, and international norming. And just to give you a bit of an introduction, Mr. Colin Robinson has worked over the past decade to domesticate Caribbean understanding and struggles about social and political inclusion of sex and gender diversity through policy work, organizational development, and communication. He is Executive Director of CAISO. It's a Trinidad and Tobago NGO founded to integrate sexual and gender diversity into nation building and governance, which uses legal and social casework for restorative justice, shapes public imagination, and mobilizes other human rights advocates. He managed the revitalization of the Caribbean Forum for Liberation and Acceptance of Genders and Sexualities by 9 leading Caribbean LGBTI NGOs. He authored the Commonwealth Opinion Paper, Decolonizing Sexual Citizenship, and he writes a Trinidad Guardian newspaper column. And just before handing over to Colin, I would just like to remind you to follow us on Twitter. You can join the discussion on our Facebook page, Caribbean Future Forum. You can also keep up to date with our website. Please feel free throughout this webinar to submit your questions through the question and answer box that you will see below the webinar viewing. And of course, without further ado, I'd like to now introduce our speaker, Colin.
Thanks a lot. Good morning, everyone. It's a bit strange talking to folks that I can't see. I'm very excited to accept the invitation from the Caribbean Future Forum to facilitate today's session. And I hope the discussion will indeed be rich. I'm a bit of a PowerPoint addict. And so I've got a slideshow that Kadeen is pulling up right now for you. I'm doing this at a bit short notice, so I apologize a little bit. We will have a polished version of the slides available for you, hopefully within a week or so. I thought, given the time I had to prepare, and up to yesterday I thought this was happening tomorrow, would be to share some specifically Caribbean insights from my activism and the sorts of analysis that movements in the region that are working on sex and gender diversity have been arriving at, the base and ground that experience in the work in Trinidad and Tobago, which is applicable in some ways and not in others across the region. I wasn't sure to what extent we had a common working frame about how sexual diversity is grounded in core concepts of gender. And I thought it would be good to start very, very rapidly with a breadth of terminology and concepts that maybe get us on the same page. I hope you don't get lost. I think any of us who study biology understand that evolution and species diversity is built on this notion that we have sexual differentiation. We have male and female in each species. So as human beings, we order our worlds. Anyone who's done basic anthropology knows that human beings order their worlds through systems of meaning, and sexual differentiation that occurs as a species is the basis of how we assign meaning and organize our worlds and our lives as human beings. And that, frankly, is my understanding of what gender is. It's a set of cultural meanings and traditions and expectations and opportunities and values that are associated with those sexual differences. Now, not all biological differences or even sexual differences we assign social meaning or the same social importance, but that sexual differentiation is a fundamental cultural construct in organizing the world. Sex, as we know, is the basis of that sexual differentiation. As a category, it's something that's biologically rooted. Men and women, male and female folks, regardless of species, have anatomical differences. At the chromosomal biological level, we're different. Sex is also a word we use to describe an activity, and that activity itself is responsible often for reproduction. It doesn't always result in reproduction. Again, that's biochemically driven, but it's also culturally regulated. Culture shapes how and when and where and why we have sex. Sex is a social activity. And gender, that organizational structure, regulates sex. Many of our indigenous cultures have incorporated sex and gender diversity in a number of different ways. But our dominant gender systems, even in the Caribbean, where we had peoples coming from other places where those weren't necessarily the gender systems, have us trapped in what I coined a young Trinidadian scholar, Linda Gill, whose slides began this presentation. And this is a presentation that we often do with social workers and other folks to help them understand sexual orientation and gender here. We're trapped in this logical fallacy that, again, we use to try and organize this complicated thing of sex and gender and sexual orientation by going to the binary, because binaries are easy. So we say there are two sexes, and we're going to complicate that in a second. And we say a specific set of gendered expectations attached to one sex, and we regulate sexuality so that that sex has sex with people of the opposite sex. Those binaries are actually challenged by real life, by what happens ordinarily in the course of social activity, and even at the biological level. A small number of human individuals at birth, we can't tell which sex, which social category, which biological category they belong to. Intersex people have been around for a long time. They're born in our hospitals on a regular basis. Their human bodies, either at birth or later on in their sexual development, produce characteristics that make it difficult for us to figure out where they fall. So it challenges the very notion that sex itself is binary. We use the term cisgender to refer to humans who have a gender expression that's traditional, men who act in a masculine way, women who act in a feminine way. And the culture says their bodies conform to our expectations of what people with bodies like theirs should do. But another group of humans, transgender people, develop an identity that doesn't match the traditional expectations for their sexual biology. We often, in modern terms, use the shorthand trans to refer to those folks. And then there's some folks who are just gender non-conforming. They're both cisgender and they're transgender, and they simply don't do what people expect. They may not develop a clear identity that's opposite to their biological gender. Then there's a complicated notion crossing all of these issues of sexual orientation. We talked about sex as an activity. Sex is also about desire. Some people don't express particular sexual desire. We call them asexual. Others manifest sexual desire and emotional attraction towards people of both genders. And we call those folks bisexual. For others, and this again is the majority of people, but not everyone, experience heterosexual sexual orientation, where they're attracted to people of a different gender than their own. And then for a small number of humans, across time and across societies, sexual orientation is towards people who have their own gender. Trans people, intersex people can be heterosexual, can be homosexual, can be bisexual. Sexual orientation towards people of the same gender is a minority trait that, like transgender experience, that like intersexuality, occurs naturally in a small percentage of the human population. From what we understand from science, from biology, from psychology, much of the determination of sexual orientation is before birth. It may not be chromosomal, but it may be shaped within the womb or very early after birth. But we also know that we have these powerful gender systems that are shaping how people are expressing themselves. And that kind of social pressure certainly influences people, how people express, deny, or even experience the sexual orientation that is shaped within them before birth. Sexuality can form a basis of identity among people, like ethnicity, like religion, like nationality. But again, because of the gender systems that we live with, gender ideologies regulate the ways in which that happens. And the same gender systems that create inequality between men and women also create environments that stigmatize, that fuel discrimination and sometimes violence to people who express same-sex desire, who express other forms of sex and gender diversity. And often that results, even though it's a human rights violation, in impunity for the offender, because there's this cultural idea, these gender systems that say that you shouldn't be that way and that punishing you is okay. The same happens for intersex people who experience bodily diversity, and both gay and lesbian people, intersex people, trans people often hide their bodies and their behavior and avoid sexual identification. And so we've seen in the HIV field, for example, the development of a term like men who have sex with men to capture that reality. You don't have to be lesbian, gay, bi, trans, or intersex, or even identify yourself as such to experience violence, to be bullied, to be attacked based on a perception that you're that. And so it's important when we think about policy making to not just think about people we can identify as such, but to think about the systems and how we create protections based on that reality. A couple quick concepts before I move into some of the more Caribbean pieces. There's a common notion that we have something to fear for people who are bisexual. And just as you can be attracted to more than one person and form stable relationships, you can be attracted to people of more than one gender and do so as well. There's a common misperception that we can change or we choose our sexual orientation and the term sexual preference arises from that. We don't. What we do sometimes choose is the way in which we act on or express that sexual orientation or that sexual desire. But often the power of cultural systems of regulation means that we aren't always free to choose how to express that. And some people find it difficult to acknowledge or to live out their sexual orientation. Sexuality is developmental. As we go through life, we discover new self-awareness about our sexual desire with time, with experience, with opportunity. So people's sexuality can shift, is somewhat fluid. But what science has discovered, clinical science, is that efforts to get people of homosexual orientation to extinguish same-sex desire don't work. There's often a linkage between sexual trauma and sexual desire. There is a link. People who experience trauma and violence, that does shape their sexuality, but it's not a primary shaper of their sexual orientation. In fact, young people who are targeted for abuse are often targeted for abuse by the perception of the abuser of their sexual orientation, that they're vulnerable, that they can be easily silenced because of the stigma, as opposed to predation turning people gay. And finally, we assign people sex at birth, whether they're intersex, whether they're trans, based on this perception of their sexual anatomy. Often, the public debate about transgender people focuses relentlessly on who gets to use what bathroom, but there are far more critical and serious issues at stake. For intersex people, sexual assignment can often result in genital mutilation without even parental consent. Doctors decide what sex you are at birth, and as you develop a gender identity developmentally, often that can conflict with the sex that you were assigned with what your birth document, your identity documents say. Both trans and intersex people can take advantage of medical technology to make their bodies conform better to their gender identities, both through hormone therapy as well as through surgeries that are getting more and more sophisticated. Some trans and intersex people have no desire to change their bodies. Often we use psychiatric diagnoses such as gender dysphoria because of the high cost of these surgeries, particularly for people who come from already marginalized communities. And so psychiatry has played this complicated role in doing this clinical work of stigmatizing people at the same time enabling them to do what we call transition, which is often a period that lasts a few years, that begins with psychological processes and dressing, and that culminates in one or multiple surgeries. We used to distinguish people who had undergone that process as transsexual, but now we tend to use trans or transgender as an encompassing term and not to focus on who's had surgery and not. But as I noted, gender markers on identity documents often last a lifetime. And trans and intersex people in most Caribbean states are unable to have their gender expression and their gender appearance and their gender identity match the gender marker on the identity document, which is a huge security issue in things like banking, where identity is verified, if you're stopped by the police, if you're crossing a border and your passport says something different than how you appear. So that's a very, very quick run through some terminology and some of the sort of constructs and how LGBTI issues are embedded in core notions of gender. Let me talk a bit about the lessons that I've learned from Caribbean life, from Caribbean LGBTI life, and the way in which movements have thought and experienced some of the challenges. And it's a far more complicated, contradictory, and everyday experience than the sorts of single stories we get that impose these notions that the Caribbean is this backward place, primitive homophobia, high HIV prevalence, and gender inequality. And Caribbean localities are often as different as they are similar. There are vast differences in social experience, in how things are regulated. For some people, Jamaica is the gayest place some of us have ever been, despite the narratives of particularly violent homophobia. And places like Trinidad and Tobago or Barbados or Guyana that may, in people's imaginations, be some of the more liberal places, are actually the places that have the stiffest penalties on the books or criminalize the widest range of behaviors. And then we find places in the Caribbean and the broader Latin American region where we have protective laws, and nonetheless, we have rampant violence, particularly against trans people. And so that leads me to the 6 concerns that I want to walk you through in terms of the Caribbean. That we fetishize the law in terms of how we think about sexual orientation in particular, but also gender identity. And I want to shift our gaze from that. We also often hide behind the mask of public opinion that nothing can change or little can change before public opinion can. As a result, there's little political championship of these issues, which is what moves them in most of the places. And our states, even if everything fell away in terms of discriminatory laws, have little capacity to respond to fulfilling the lives and rights of their LGBTI citizens. Fundamentalism is a troubling phenomenon in the region that counters or moves towards development. We have very frail human rights protections. Migration is a very interesting issue that I want to raise. And I want to end with this notion that seeking justice, particularly for LGBTI people, even when there are protections, has costs. This is stepping out of the region a little bit, but it's very convenient to cite a popular American talk show host who underscores the notion that, and I just yesterday met with a public official who asked, why don't we just let the people decide these issues? And the very foundation of notions of human rights is that we don't let people decide. Human rights are not subject to popular opinion, not for any minority groups, not for anyone. That everyone in a society is entitled to a core set of protections and equality, whether they're popular or not. Public opinion is often used by politicians when they go even to human rights reviews. They say, oh, there isn't a political mandate to fulfill the human rights of LGBTI people. Well, it sort of doesn't matter. But Peter Wickham at CADRIS in Barbados has worked with the UN and with community-based groups to actually look at what people are thinking about various indices of sexual citizenship across the region. And the answers are much more complicated, and they provide some indicators of where there are openings to make change. The biggest opening is in the notion that we believe across the region, to different degrees in different places, that people should not be discriminated against based on their sexual orientation. However, we find that there's strong resistance, or nations are deeply divided over the issue of decriminalizing. In part because we know that our sodomy laws are not actively enforced. Grenada may be the exception to that. But we believe that decriminalization sends a moral message on the part of the state that we oppose. We believe that behavior is wrong, but just like you can horn your wife, but you shouldn't lose your job, we believe that LGBTI people should not suffer certain kinds of discrimination in employment, in education. And polling can help us identify the ways in which the windows to change. And this slide talks about the Trinidad and Tobago experience, that only 15% of the population believes people should be discriminated against, whereas 23% of the population opposes same-sex marriage. So there's a wide window, and there are different targets for change. We fetishize the law considerably, and we think that the law is both the problem and the solution, and that the law is colonial. The laws criminalizing sexual desire in the region are. The fact is the opposite, that every time we've opened our law books in the Commonwealth Caribbean to sexual offenses law reform, we have criminalized more specific forms of behavior, and we've enhanced penalties for same-sex desire. And we've done that into the 1980s, well after independence. This is an illustration of what Trinidad and Tobago has done. We moved at independence in 1962 with a penalty for buggery, which was anal sex, to a penalty of 5 years, to a penalty of 25 years in the year 2000. We explicitly criminalized same-sex sexual activity, which was not explicitly criminalized at independence, 25 years almost after independence. We criminalized sexual touching between minors at the same time. And last year, a law went into effect, passed in 2012, that increased that penalty from 10 years to life in prison for young people who touch each other sexually. So the laws are not colonial, but the law is also, and the buggery and sodomy laws, and many of our jurisdictions have serious indecency laws, in addition to buggery laws. The law also, I think, has been overly fetishized as the problem and the solution. The law that most affects LGBTI people in Trinidad and Tobago is the Summary Offences Act provision against loitering, which is used to sweep men in dresses off street all the time. That's the law that's actively enforced, not the sodomy laws. Articles like this appear in the newspaper on a regular basis with names and addresses of defendants and their images and colorful descriptions of what they wore to court. Most of our constitutions, and the earliest are the worst, also protect all colonial laws from constitutional challenges based on the Bills of Rights in the Constitution. Those savings clauses narrowed with time. So the earliest states to achieve independence have the most restrictive savings clauses. And states like Jamaica have eliminated the savings clauses except for sexual offenses and other moral issues. I had a video that I was trying to play, but I don't think it made it to the slide, which was a government minister in Trinidad and Tobago being asked about gay rights. And his answer essentially was that there's no such thing as gay rights, that everybody has rights. And he's right. But the reality is that those rights aren't fulfilled for certain groups of people. And so they exist theoretically. You go back to the Rachel Maddow slide. But the challenge is how we get states to fulfill those rights. For that, we need political champions. If all the laws disappeared tomorrow, state bureaucracies would still face challenges in how to respond to the needs of our LGBTI populations and to develop policy and programs to do so, just as we do for other groups, elderly people, children, people with disabilities, ethnic minorities. These are familiar facts about the region. We trail the hemisphere in social inclusion and fulfillment of rights of LGBTI people. 11 of the 12 states in the English-speaking Caribbean still criminalize private adult indecency through different statutes. And as I said before, once we do law reform, we criminalize more things. We also have enacted social protection legislation that explicitly or by omission doesn't include LGBTI people. There are notable exceptions to that. Barbados, last week, I believe, enacted domestic violence legislation that's a model because it includes same-sex domestic violence. St. Lucia in 2006 included sexual orientation in the protections of its labor code. How does change happen? It requires champions, but we've had champions for other issues in the region. So the notion that we can't change or we're not ready is false. Billy Miller decriminalized abortion 2 decades ago. The Bahamas decriminalized homosexuality more than a decade ago, a decade and a half ago. School blogging's been prohibited in Trinidad and Tobago. Marijuana's been decriminalized. So with leadership, these things can happen. And when we look north to the US, the shifts that we've seen in mainstream acceptance of LGBTI issues have happened over the course of a single generation. Fundamentalism, and I don't have a definition for fundamentalism here, but ultimately I mean religious tenets that attempt to prescribe behaviors and also enjoin the state in restricting behaviors in particularly narrow ways. And we've seen an increasing turn to evangelical faiths and fundamentalist faiths in the Caribbean region. And this has a huge impact on how sexuality evolves as a developmental issue, because it's become an ideological one with a core commitment to keeping it an ideological one, which challenges how we make it an issue that is about population and that is about fulfilling development goals. Fundamentalism is attractive because it helps us make order of a world that's increasingly challenging and disordered, where traditional systems of meaning and gender are under threat, where narco violence we live with, where state power is declining, where citizen power is declining, where the independence movements we grew up with that provided political meaning have been replaced by this neoliberal politics. So there are lots of reasons why fundamentalism is growing. North American movements also are targeting English-speaking states in Africa and the Caribbean because there's little to win for them at home. And we are ready targets, particularly because we don't have strong separation of faith and state. And because in some instances we're perceived that the advances that may be happening in some places are perceived as threatening to these movements. What are these movements doing? They're grooming our diplomats who have little direction from capital on sexuality issues because it's a trade in the environment. And they end up being much more accountable to their sense of faith than to their state, from whom they get their direction, or to development interests. And they think that we're naturally conservative on sexuality, so those are the positions that we're taking. We've seen in Belize the sweeping influx of both money and evangelization around the legal challenge to the sodomy law. And elsewhere in the region, we've seen the ads, the junk science that challenges HIV policy and public health issues, even around HPV and vaccination in Trinidad and Tobago. We saw the deployment of the same junk science by Christian fundamentalism. We've seen people educating judges and leaders and slowly building these moral panics around sexuality and development, sexual and reproductive rights. How does this unfold? It unfolds through CARICOM's voting as a bloc in international fora that are doing global norm setting around sexual and reproductive rights, where we side with the Islamic Conference and the Holy See and certain African blocs to retard global progress, not just for a region, but within the region. We also see that bloc voting holds the region as a whole to the lowest common denominator. The most conservative political leader gets to decide what CARICOM sexuality policy is. We have to break that block in some way, because what it means is the development level of the region's lowest performer on sexual and reproductive rights and health is what we're holding the entire region and the voters in every locality to. We have frail human rights protection systems. We're small island developing states, that's the plea always about human rights obligations. But what that means is that we have weak and still maturing institutions. We have colonial cultures of inequality, and rights violations have a ripple effect because we're small. So rights bearers actually face particular conditions because we're small island developing states. Impunity is common. We're much more likely to punish difference extrajudicially, and people depend more on social structures, on communities for support. We have weak systems of evidence-based sexuality education. We don't understand sexual minorities. And what's worse, and I'll come to that a little later, is that many of the backstopping mechanisms, the supranational oversight mechanisms for human rights, we have not acceded to. So human rights protection stops at our borders. And if our domestic systems are weak, rights bearers suffer. Migration is an important factor as well. And we know that asylum claims based on sexual orientation in North America, the Caribbean shows up as the region that is providing, that is representing most of those claims. Well, it's the region that has the largest number of claims. But we're also seeing within the region people fleeing persecution, for example, from Jamaica to Trinidad and Tobago or to Curacao. Migration is a long tradition out of the region, and migration fraud certainly is. But we need to evaluate what are the development costs of this migration. So let me try and wind down with a couple observations about the Trinidad and Tobago experience. We've noticed a number of focal points, and one of them has been schools. Schools provide an opportunity to be nurseries for tolerance. Instead, they're sites for bullying, for gender stereotyping, that result not just in LGBTI underachievement, but male heterosexual underachievement because they perceive scholarship and achievement as gendered. Teen suicide and self-harm we see among young people. One of our domestic organizations formed as a result of a young person's suicide. And we see in Trinidad and Tobago not public violence, as we've seen in other places in the region, but we understand violence against LGBTI people to be fundamentally domestic. And we've seen a cascade of discrimination in families, in the same schools, in communities, in employment, and a failure of safety net housing services, men's shelters that don't welcome gender non-conforming people, women's shelters that say, oh no, we don't deal with that kind of domestic violence when lesbians battered by their parents show up. And so we've seen, as we've seen in other capitals in the region, a push towards homelessness. We've also seen the failure of police protection. Because people see themselves as unapprehended felons, they don't seek justice, they don't trust the police. Police often re-stigmatize them through name calling. And so criminals see LGBTI people as an opportune target. We've seen a rash of entrapments using sex sites and other kinds of ways in which LGBTI people have become vulnerable and not had access to protection. I talked about public opinion with the Trinidad and Tobago example earlier. The problem has been political leadership, not the resistance of the public in terms of their opinions. We've also seen a pattern in Trinidad and Tobago in legislation of entrenching the all human rights violations. So we passed new laws. The Children Act that I mentioned before, that raised the age of consent and increased penalties, protected minors. It exempts sex within child marriage, which we have in Trinidad and Tobago. People as young as 12 can be married in certain faiths. So you protect children, but then you say that people who marry children are exempt from the enhanced penalty for crimes against children with sex, except if they're having anal sex. Then anal sex in the old regime. So all the old human rights violations of child marriage, of criminalizing consensual anal sex, you carry forward into new legislation. You decriminalize sexuality between children, lovely move. And then you say children of the same sex who touch each other are exempt from that decriminalization and go to jail for life. But we've seen protective legislation in the region. Barbados, I mentioned recently. We've seen Guyana change its constitution at the legislative level to include protections based on sexual orientation. I mentioned St. Lucia. And even in Trinidad and Tobago in 2004 and 2011, we included affirmative elements in different pieces of legislation on privacy and on extradition. Movement thinking is critical in shaping how we move forward. And in the locally, we've come together as 6 different organizations in our recent election campaign and focus on a number of prescriptions that I wanted to share as thoughts that may or may not have relevance elsewhere in the region. We've talked about the critical importance of representation and looked at our Senate's independent benches, which are factors throughout, I think, the Commonwealth, Caribbean, as opportunities as they've been used before for disability or gender or geographic representation to increase LGBTI representation where governors general can make appointments. We stress the importance of championing equality and non-discrimination by politicians, of the state listening and building its capacity, of course, of strengthening those human rights and redress mechanisms, and increasingly saying, let's have supranational oversight so that our people are protected, of targeting police, not doing broad-based police training, but doing targeted training to capacitate key parts of the police force as opposed to broad-based training. And we've also noted that the good things in policy and state capacity for intersex people who legislators get, understand, and their bodies make that easy, those are the same benefits the transgender people who legislators don't get need. We've talked about setting aside public housing units to create targeted transitional supporting programs for housing for homeless youth. These are issues that are faced in Castries, in Montego Bay, in Kingston as well. And also we've talked about having disowned minors get access directly to social welfare. We've talked about schools as nurseries for tolerance, where you're doing bullying protection, you're doing sexuality education, but you're also building human rights cultures for the future adults. And we've talked about not wasting political capital on decriminalizing unenforced laws, but focusing on protective legislation, as we've seen in Barbados and St. Lucia. Meanwhile, what states can do is formalize the process of not prosecuting consensual sexuality by declaring a moratorium, as we've done in some instances with death penalty. I want to close with one very quick idea, and I'm not going to walk through all the points on the slide, so you can ask questions. And that's that justice seeking has costs. That's the core conclusion we've made in our movement here domestically. That even when you have measures in place for people to get justice and are admittedly weak, that seeking justice has a cost, and people need supports. One, they lack confidence and self-efficacy in justice seeking, but also the cost of exposure are high, and that we need to provide support for LGBTI people to seek justice. It's not a straightforward or easy thing, and justice seeking may enhance vulnerability even when it results in some in a positive judgment. So I want to close there, put up a way to contact me if you want to continue the discussion beyond today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And so we have just about 15 minutes. We'll take a few questions. We already have some questions here. So I'll just go quickly into that. The first question: in understanding the reality that the push to ensure equality for all is inculcated into a society such as TNT, apart from building awareness, would you suggest any effective micro-pragmatic efforts that would aid the simple understanding of the distinction between gender and sexuality?
I'm not sure that cognitive understandings are as critical as emotional engagement. And the most important thing that I think changes public perception of sexual and gender diversity in a positive way is when people show up in their workplaces, in their families, in their schools. Obviously, visibility, as I noted, often has costs, but it's that showing up when it results in a positive outcome that has an enormously transformative impact in shaping people not as these monsters or these strange things that people don't understand, but people with whom you have a very real connection. And it's politicians with LGBTI people and their families who are most likely to be champions on these issues.
Thank you. And another question. In academia, the term LGBTQ continues to be used, while I'm hearing LGBTI being used in this webinar. So please clarify the distinction between Q and I, because in literary theory, we teach the notion of queer as referring to the idea that our identities are performative and not universal.
Sure. In a policy realm, that's much less useful. Certainly, there are people who identify as queer. I'm struggling to help people understand what trans is. Helping them understand what queer is may be useful, but ultimately, helping them understand how gendered systems work and how they impinge on people's daily lives is more important than many of the things that literary theory may be doing. Queer also often comes with a stigma of being imported. Many people in the region are now embracing the term. I'm happy to use it, but the amount of time I would spend helping people understand what queer meant, I think it's not a term that's particularly useful, I think, in policy discourse. Including intersex people in policy discourse, I think, is critical, and as I said, can often be a real important lever for winning gains for trans people as well.
Okay, thank you. And another question, what role can education, formal and otherwise, play in changing attitudes towards LGBT people and the laws that may discriminate against them?
I think education plays a fundamental role, and we've talked about schools as being nurseries for tolerance, not just through formal educational programs, but through, well, not just through programs that target that sort of inclusion, but through programs that help people understand formally what sexuality is, help people understand sexuality as a developmental issue in their own lives, and certainly help people understand how diversity operates, sexual, gender, ethnic, religious diversity operate in societies where we all have to get along.
Okay, and maybe the last question. Given that Trinidad and Tobago often follows closely in the shadow of the United States, at times even being called Little America, how does the US Supreme Court ruling impact the LGBTQI equality fight in Trinidad and Tobago?
I'm not sure that I agree with the premise of the question that we follow closely in the shadow of the United States. We've not followed the United States on a whole range of issues in this sphere. I think that social media, certainly the fact that we're part of a global community of discourse has helped open up and shape ideas. The Supreme Court same-sex marriage decision, I assume, is what's being referenced. There was a lot of discussion about it. I got requested to do more media interviews than any domestic issue. So it helps create discourse. I don't think any legislature is following, but I'm hopeful that policy shifts, as we discover policy shifts in other parts of the region. I mean, Canada did this years ago, a decade ago. Most of our neighbors in Latin America have moved forward in a range of ways, including legislation that protects trans people. I'm hoping when we realize how isolated we are, not just in reference to the US, but in reference to almost all our neighbors in the hemisphere, that that's what will help motivate change. And when politicians talk to their peers about how that leadership was possible, that sort of political dialogue, I think, is what will be most transformative.
Well, I think that is about it for the questions right at this moment. I don't know if you have any closing remarks that you would like to make to sort of, I guess, sum up the discussion.
I'd be eager, if you have Kadine's email, I think it's part of the invitation. I'd love to hear evaluations of the webinar. Was it useful? Was it accessible? Did it help you in your work, and in what ways? And I'd love to hear suggestions about how we could do more of this, what format would make sense. CAISO is part of a regional entity called the Caribbean Forum for Acceptance and Liberation of Genders and Sexualities, CARIFLAGS, and certainly I'd be eager to figure out what role CARIFLAGS and or other organizations like CAISO could play in localities where additional participants are in facilitating similar discourse.
Okay. So maybe I can give you one
Sure.
You mentioned earlier in the presentation that there isn't much of a separation of faith and government, etc. Do you think this is also part of the reason in Jamaica that people charged as counselors in high schools are so resistant to assisting students who seek their help with gender issues, especially where it relates to LGBT matters?
Yes, what we fail to do is train personnel in service provision roles that their personal beliefs are separable from their professional obligations. It's particularly important in counseling, where many of the things that I believe, I can't preach to the young person who comes in, because my counseling has to be centered on their needs. We've had an experience here in Trinidad and Tobago in one of our public STI testing facilities, where a young man who went in for an HIV test, who was brought up Hindu, was in his post-test counseling session, told by the counselor that she felt obligated by her faith to offer him all his options, and that one of his options was giving his life to Jesus Christ. Helping people understand the inappropriateness of those engagements and where their professional duties end and how they're guided by that is absolutely critical. And yes, counseling in schools can play a pivotal role in keeping a young person alive, and the wrong message can be fatal.
Okay. And then another question, is changing society's attitudes more important than changing the law?
I believe so. I believe that the law changes when attitudes change, that we both require champions, but it's more the case that the law catches up with where social discourse is than that the law actually changes social discourse. I'm a big advocate of low-hanging fruit. I'm a big advocate of policy changes that are incremental, and of changing things and trying to change things first where there's more social consensus. Often trying to change things around which there's a lot of polarization, and certainly the sodomy laws in the region evidently are the case. The polls say it, the Lee says it. What we end up doing is we get a judicial win, but it involves a lot of losses for people who have very strong feelings. And so we face an even higher hurdle in changing public opinion for having got the judicial victory. Absolutely, rights protections are important. And if a politician wants to decriminalize tomorrow, I'm not going to say don't do it. But I agree with the premise of the question that changing attitudes has a much more important long-term effect on the lived lives of LGBTI people than often targeting particular pieces of legislation that in some instances may not have an impact on a person's daily life. In Trinidad and Tobago, there are not arrests for buggery. So removing the buggery law, yes, over the course of time, it will remove the force of the law in legitimating discrimination, but it won't remove, it won't decriminalize the Quran or Leviticus. Enacting a protective law that forbids discrimination and has legal sanctions for doing so, and in the case of our Equal Opportunity Act, lowers the threshold for redress by allowing conciliation and other measures without a lawyer for getting redress. That's something somebody can use the day after the law takes effect.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Of course, to our viewers, thank you for your feedback. We've had viewers saying that it's been an interesting, informative webinar. So thank you. Just in closing, I would like to say, of course, thank you to our speaker, Mr. Robinson. Your webinar has definitely been very informative. For those of you who may have experienced a lag in the presentation, I think in re-uploading the webinar recording, we will ensure that the slides are in place with the audio. Yeah. And I'd like to say thank you to our partners, of course, to you, our viewers. Please remember to follow this discussion, continue to send your comments, continue to send any questions, possibly. We have Mr. Collins, Mr. Robinson's contact information. Be sure to follow us on Twitter, join our Facebook page, Caribbean Future Forum, and do enjoy the rest of your day.
Have a great day, folks.